The Regent's Reign, Chapter 19. Another Glimpse. Arthur frowned. The ride out to the small town besieged by the Griffin had been grueling. Rain had delayed them by a solid day. Everyone was in a bit of a foul mood. Neither of the two that usually brought laughter to the patrols were there, both Gawain and Merlin being off on a mission for Gaius. They'd taken Percival with them too, and Arthur's uncle seemed quite miffed about that. "I just don't understand why she took your two best men to pick some herbs," he said, shaking his head, water from his hair splattering the horse in front of him. Arthur let out a slightly annoyed huff.
"Because she knew I'd send them out after her if she didn't. It may have escaped your notice, Uncle, but Merlin is something of a trouble magnet."
"I see. If you'll allow me to be candid with you, sire," Agravain began. Arthur nodded for him to continue. "I am curious how this relationship came about. I've not heard much, but it is a bit odd. Prince Regent courting a physician's apprentice." The pause told Arthur that Agravain had wanted to say servant. "You've heard stories of love at first sight?" Lancelot asked.
"Don't let him fool you. That is not how this began."
Arthur chided with a grin. Lancelot and Elian laughed. "Could have fooled me," Elian said.
"No. This was more of a landslide. It starts so small you might not know it was happening. But then suddenly you're buried,"
Arthur said, his smile growing with every word. "Even I've not heard this story, and I think I've known you the longest out of the three of us," Lancelot said, gesturing to himself, Elian, and Agravain. "Recently, at least," he said, bowing his head to Arthur's uncle.
"When we first met, we could not stand each other. My father made her my maid,"
the prince admitted. "Why?" Agravain asked.
"Because she saved my life. Prolonged contact made her insolence more tolerable, and it helped that she's actually rather amusing in her opinions of people,"
Arthur said, shaking his head.
"There was a knight who entered the last great tournament in Camelot with an enchanted shield. Valiant, I think his name was. It was years ago. Merlin had him pegged as a creep from the beginning."
"She is an excellent judge of character," Lancelot said with a small smile.
"Never tell her I said this, but yes, she is,"
Arthur said, laughing lightly. "So you fell in love with her insolence?" Agravain asked, looking rather confused.
"No, it's what made us friends, though. That took some time. But I think I can pinpoint the moment things changed,"
Arthur said, his face turning pensive. "What was it?" Elian asked, looking genuinely curious. He'd never seen the first phase of Arthur and Merlin's relationship. He'd only known them together, and he couldn't quite fathom a world where they genuinely disliked one another or were mere friends.
"About 4 months after she started working for me, there was a feast. It was to celebrate a peace with Mercia. She ran into the banquet hall in a panic and snatched the goblet from my hand. Said it had been poisoned. To this day, I have no idea if she knew all that she was risking with that accusation. If it hadn't been true, then my father would have handed her over to Bayard to do with what he liked, probably for execution,"
Arthur said, the smile sliding from his face. "She accused a king and lived to tell the tale?" Agravain said, disbelief clear in his voice.
"She almost didn't. The cup was poisoned, though we discovered later not by Bayard, by a sorceress by the name of Nimue attempting to start a war."
"Did the tester who confirmed it live?" Agravain asked offhandedly.
"Merlin did, yes,"
Arthur said, earning cries of disbelief from his knights and a slightly raised eyebrow from his uncle.
"My father made her test it, then forbid me from going after the cure. I went anyway. That was the first time I genuinely disobeyed my father. That was when I knew things with Merlin were different. I didn't realize until much later what that different feeling was.
When was that? Lancelot asked fondly.
When the troll my father married accused Merlin of stealing her seal of nobility.
Arthur said with a slight smile. A screech interrupted the demands for that story, though. Arthur lifted a hand, and the contingent of guards they'd brought with them readied weapons. He pulled his sword, Elian, Lancelot, and Agravain following his example. Silence filled the forest around them. They should still be an hour away from the village. A second later, the lower layer of branches to their left shattered. They were all forced to dive flat to their horses, as a massive griffin careened over them. A figure dodged after it, moving with preternatural speed for something that looked to be human, or was at least shaped like one. The brown robes Arthur got a glimpse of as they ran through were familiar enough. He got his horse under control first and took off after the druid girl. There had been 2 griffins. 2 of them. By the time they'd found the village, it had been in ruins. Survivors were fleeing from the ruins, chased by the creatures. She'd enchanted Gawain's sword, and he'd felled the first one, but the second had fled. Merlin drew a dagger and gave chase, practically flying through the trees as time slowed around her. She barely noticed the patrol from Camelot, glancing at the mounted knights and almost catching Lancelot's eye, but never quite sure he spotted her. Screams sounded from up ahead, and Merlin was forced to slow as the slap of voices in her head sent her staggering. Druids. A camp set up nearby the town. She knew it wasn't Isildur's, as they had been camped at the foothills of the mountains of Asktir just a few days ago. She sped back up as the sound of hooves reached her ears. Dodging up a rise that the knights would not be able to scale on horseback, Merlin spotted her quarry. Flipping the knife in her hand, she spoke, her voice echoing and distorted. Luckily, it didn't affect the spell at all, as her dagger was enveloped in blue flame. She didn't spot Arthur pulled to a halt at the base of the sheer rise and watch as the flaming knife vanished. Both of them clapped hands to their ears as the griffin gave a death scream. Only then did Merlin bother to look around and down, straight at Arthur. She darted off before he could get a real look under the hood. It would be difficult. Isildur had assured her that the runes woven into the embroidery of her cloak would act as a glamour as long as the cloak was worn. Even if they were damaged, the spell would still distort the face enough for others not to recognize her, though he warned that it would do nothing to disguise her aura. Any with magical sight would not be fooled by the illusion. She'd asked for the veil in their correspondence through Archimedes because that was how Arthur had seen Emrys. It would make it easier to hide if something went wrong. She made it down to the base of the rise on the other side. Arthur would have to dismount or find a way around. The druids were bowing. Several had dropped to their knees.
Emrys, it is as the prophecies have said. You've come to save us all,
one of them called. Merlin blinked. Someone had left out that bit of the prophecies. Bringing back magic, sure, but saving all the druids? Well, one went with the other, she supposed. You need to move, now. There are knights coming this way, she called, voice echoing and rolling over the encampment. The bowing figures sprang into action. Merlin turned, pressing her hands to the rise and speaking in the old tongue. The spell would cause fog to roll off the embankment, deep, thick fog that anyone could get lost in. She could keep an eye on Arthur in that easily enough and ensure he made it back to the other knights. She finished her spell and turned, blinking, to find a druid behind her, kneeling and holding up her dagger, the one she'd used to kill the griffin, dead less than 10 feet away, and already starting to decay back into the elements that had created it. She took her knife, glad it had been recovered. It was one of those Elian and Gwen had given her for her birthday.
Thank you, Emrys. We will be of whatever service we can,
the man said, nearly reverent. Merlin shoved the questions aside. You and yours must leave now. I will not have you getting caught. As the champion commands, he said, and this time she could not hold back her questions. Champion? The goddess's champion, sent by the triple goddess to do her work upon this land and restore what was lost, he said, never once raising his head. With that pronouncement, he went to help with the breakdown of the camp, which took only moments. Then those that had been there were fleeing into the fog, leaving Merlin stunned until a figure broke through it. The minute she spotted him, she scaled the ridge again, racing along the top of it and out of sight, dissipating the fog with a thought as Arthur's voice called after her. Wait!